Well, thanks everyone for coming back. Hope you had a nice to get some break. This afternoon, I think it's a switch of focus from the domestic into the wider picture. There's two sessions this afternoon. Zoe's leading on this first one, and then there's a second one looking at the position in Staffordshire. And we've got some speakers talking about the energy situation and the future really of energy provision in Staffordshire and the wider region. So yeah, switch of focus for this afternoon. So I'm really pleased that Zoe can make it today. I think you're one of the local champions.
Well, local.
Of the work that we've been doing in MCA, and we've been following the work you've been doing. You've been helping us over the years to position ourselves and help us know who to speak to. We've attended a few conferences that you've been at, and it's given us confidence as an MCA to know that we're not on our own really. There's the academics are, the councils are coming on board now, businesses are coming on board, the Building Society coming on board, so you know, it's really great to be here for a second year. With no further delay, can I introduce Professor Zoe Robinson to talk about the smart and local energy transition, the future of our energy system. So over lunch we were wondering what this conference will be like in 10 years' time, and maybe we'll find out soon. So over to you, Zoe. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mark, for the invitation. So I'm going to talk for maybe 20 minutes or so, it's the aim, and then hopefully have lots of opportunities for questions, for discussion at the end. If I talk about this level, is this okay for people back? Yeah. So this session is going to be a bit different to the morning session, which I'm afraid I couldn't make, but I understand was sort of very practical. I'm an academic, I don't do practical. So I'm going to take a step back and actually talk a bit about the sort of bigger context and sort of really try and put into context how our energy systems are changing. And actually the extent of the change in our whole energy systems is so great. We are all having to unlearn everything that we've ever been taught about how energy works. And hopefully I'll take you through a bit of that journey through to then thinking about, you know, why thinking about energy at a local scale is now so important, which should hopefully be a lovely segue into the final session. We'll see. So our energy systems are changing. They are becoming more localised. We need to engage in them in different ways, and so we are going to be very much part of this change. You know, this is what our energy systems look like now. This is what they were several hundred years ago, using things sort of locally on our doorstep, you know, water, wood from the forests. Then we discovered coal. Well, actually the Chinese were using coal 4,000 years ago, but coal really allowed us to start to sort of transport energy, allowing you know, the Industrial Revolution. We then discovered coal. Sorry, when I say coal, what I meant was oil. Oil then allowed us to separate it into lots of different sort of products. And then we really discovered gas. So these are all of our sort of you know, different fossil fuels, all useful for different things, very much what our understanding of, you know, our energy systems are now all about. But it kind of shows, you know, we've had these constant changes within our energy system. So, you know, we are just in another phase of energy transition. You can see, you know, the extent of these changes. So here you can see, you know, coal, the fossil fuel we've been using for longest, gradually grown, where oil's come in, where gas has come in, and just this you know, massive acceleration of the use of fossil fuels, which has allowed us to develop wonderful lives. But of course, it has some negative consequences as well, and our dawning realisation that although we've known about the science linking carbon dioxide emissions and atmospheric temperature for about 200 years, we're finally getting the message that this is a really bad thing and we need to do something about it. So One of the so the UK is seen, or was absolutely seen as a global leader in climate change legislation when in 2008 the Climate Change Act came into being, which committed the government to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The problem was that every single sector thought that they were the 20% that wasn't included. It was only really in 2019 where we saw the change to the Climate Change Act and the commitment to be net zero by 2050 that we've really seen an inflection point in terms of acceleration of action and all sectors going, oh, we have to do something about this. Come on. So, one of the reasons, obviously, that we need to start to think about doing energy differently is because of climate change. We don't have to go into that in any more detail. It's not just the reason. Greenhouse gases come from lots of different sectors, are associated with lots of different parts of our lives, our industry, the waste we produce, our agricultural systems. But globally, about 3/4 of all of the greenhouse gas emissions are associated with energy. And that is why we need to really focus on understanding what changes we need to make to our energy systems. So these are often referred to as the energy trilemma, the three different aspects of energy systems that we need to address. So yeah, carbon emissions, but also affordability. Never before have we had the cost of energy so much on our minds as with security of supply. We'd kind of forgotten about security of supply issues up until February last year. And so this is really what the future of energy systems are going to look like, around decarbonisation, but also that being led by digitisation. So hear a lot of talk around smart energy systems, that's the digitisation, and also decentralisation. So moving away from these trends of big central power stations we don't have to think about because we just get electricity at the end of it and we don't need to really think much more. And electrification, I think, is also a key part of that transition. So this, as I say, is a key part of the future of our energy systems. Absolutely phenomenal in terms of what wind technology is now giving us. So these new generation of offshore wind turbines, one full rotation, that can power an average UK household for 2 days. That's phenomenal. So when we think about sort of, wind turbines, it's not just those small ones onshore, but actually, huge energy potential from these offshore wind farms. And the offshore wind sector, has accelerated at a rate that no one was predicting 6 or 7 years ago. And I think that's something really to take away, that we often don't know where those sort of inflection points are, and just because something isn't economic now doesn't mean that that's not going to change. And sometimes it needs sort of different subsidies to be put in place for that to happen, but we've seen a number of these real sort of significant changes. If we start to look at the UK, this is the total energy supply by source in the UK. And critically, it is total energy, so this involves transport as well. So we see the key things we're supposed to bring out here are biofuels and waste coming in as energy sources. The yellow, only a small amount there, is in renewables. Coal really starting to be phased out. But remember, that was energy as a whole. This is electricity generation. So in the UK, we've seen huge decarbonisation of our electricity grid. So when people sort of go, oh well, you know, electric cars, where does the electricity come from? The key point is that the electricity has much lower carbon footprint than it used to do, and that will continue to decrease. So again, we can see over time the amount of coal going into our national electricity generation has massively decreased, and you see that purple wedge on the bottom right. It's solar, but large amounts of wind coming in. So our electricity generation by source is changing hugely. Now, another thing that we'll often hear from people is like, oh, wind turbines, oh, they weren't even going, it was windy, and they weren't moving. God, they're rubbish, they don't work. There might be a reason for them not turning, is because they haven't been allowed to. So we have a big problem in this country at the moment that our grid infrastructure, which is 100 years old, I think it was 1926 that the legislation came in that basically created the national grid. So it's very old and it cannot cope with a lot of the renewables which are now available to come on stream. So ultimately, where you might have large wind farms, they might be asked to be turned off because the grid can't cope with it. But they are being compensated for the fact that they can't generate energy. So the stats here were saying that in 2020, through 3.8 terawatt hours of electricity were wasted. So it was curtailed, it couldn't be used at a cost of 282 million, which comes onto our bills, and that's enough enough to power every home in Wales. So actually, it's not the turbines which are the problem, it's the grid infrastructure here, which needs massive investment. So, what we see, I'm just going to read out this quote here, is we are on the cusp of the largest disruption of industry and society since the first industrial revolution. Large, centralised, top-down, supplier-centric energy is on its way out. It's being replaced by modular, distributed, bottom-up, open, knowledge-based, consumer-centric energy. We are living through fantastically exciting times. And there's been some recent work which has also shown that if we start to think about our energy systems on a local scale, thinking about sort of places as being different and having different solutions for different places, it's a lot cheaper than if we just plonk the same solutions in every place. So these figures on the right from a recent report from PricewaterhouseCoopers, which are saying that a place-agnostic scenario, we plonk the same in every place, would need 195 billion investment, whereas something which is place-specific would need a 58 billion investment. And in terms of looking at wider social benefits, we can put a cost on that. We get almost double the economic benefits associated with wider social benefits from that place-specific scenario. So what we're seeing is a move from this centralised, same for everywhere, to actually different solutions in different places, which will also be a much cheaper way to decarbonise. So, exciting times. And this is good because our centralised systems are massively inefficient. So this diagram sort of showing that you're losing 60% of your energy in your power plant. You lose a few percent in transmission, and then you lose more in the use here. Old-fashioned light bulb. Hope no one's got those anymore. So again, it's just sort of highlighting the inefficiencies with our old traditional centralised power energy systems. So in the UK, we've seen some really interesting interesting movements in the past few decades. So you'll see the blue line is emissions associated with energy production, and you'll see that that has really sort of dropped off, meaning that nowadays transport is actually the sector with the highest emissions. And you can see that there on that bar graph. So we also need to think about all of the things in our life which are part of our energy system. And just emphasising this. This is showing the top left is a graph of carbon intensity of electricity in the UK. So showing how much, what's the carbon footprint basically of a kilowatt hour, and we can see how that's hugely decreased in the last decade. And the bottom right shows us the changing composition of sources going into electricity production in the UK, and that sort of tempering wedge of coal. And what this means is, comes back to this electrification of things like transport, things like heating. That electrification works in terms of decarbonisation because we have the decarbonising grid. Another key change in thinking about our energy systems is, we probably all grew up, and I certainly remember this in school, being told how our energy systems needed to be able to meet our peak demand, that time where people switched the kettle on in the middle of Coronation Street. So that's sort of, the supply needed to be able to meet that demand. As more and more renewables come online, and so our supply is variable, actually what we are now looking at is systems where we need to adjust demand in order to meet that supply. So that's a fundamental shift in how we think about our energy systems. So this graph here is showing us a number of, we've got a week. We can see how supply, the blue line, sort of is changing through that week, and some fluctuations in demand. So there are two things here that we can do in order to help our demand meet our supply. So one is called peak shaving. So where we're trying to decrease our demand. So where that first arrow is, we've got a low, in our supply. And so what we need to do is try and reduce our demand at that point to meet that supply. But then here between days 3 and 4, our supply is higher than our demand. So what we want to be able to do there is to store that surplus energy in order to address shortfalls at a later point. So that's referred to as load shifting. And so this very much fits with what we've seen in the past few months. We've seen stories in the papers about, National Grid, they're going to ask people to stop using energy to prevent blackouts. Well, it's not really to prevent blackouts. And actually, this is part of how we are now having to manage our energy systems. So it's about trying to reduce demand at those peak demand times. And so the graph on the left here is showing the average UK household electricity demand with the evening peak between 5 and 9 p.m. And that's when the grid is under most pressure. It's when energy is most expensive. It's generally when it's most carbon intense as well. So that's a key point where we want to reduce demand. So this shows us how the sources feeding into our electricity generation, so this is nationally, changes over time. So I think there's about a day and a half within that, and you can see that at different times you've got different proportions our grid. And that then has an implication to the carbon intensity of our electricity. So we've got 24 hours in a day here, and this line is showing you what the carbon intensity is of our electricity at different times of day on average. And so that very early morning time, much lower carbon intensity. That's largely because you've got much lower demand. Now, one thing for those people who might be turning into energy geeks in this fascinating new world of energy, if you haven't looked at this before, you might want to look at MyGridGB and the dashboards on there to give you real-time data on the UK energy mix. So this was the mix of different sources feeding into our grid at 9 AM this morning, which obviously isn't the time that I was finishing off these slides. And what did we have at 9 AM this morning? Well, okay, we haven't had a lot of wind. We've still got almost 8%. Not a great day for solar, but we still don't have any coal on the grid, but we do have 55% gas. Also worth noting, 13% of imports feeding in. And if you're interested in looking at the local area composition, then electricityinfo.org is another source that you can go for all of your energy geekery of what your energy is comprised of, what your electricity is comprised of at any one point. Okay, so those are some broad sort of changes happening. We need to also really understand more about energy in our own homes. And this probably links to things that we were covering this morning. So questions for you. So we've got a pie chart here, 4 different slices of a lovely energy pie. Those slices are space heating, cooking, lighting and appliances, and water heating. So what is the biggest one? What's the big green one?
Space heating.
Excellent, there we are. Space heating, then water heating, then lighting and appliances, then cooking. Now, actually, a lot of people don't know that. Most people still think that electricity is what they think about first and foremost. They'll think about appliances. Which always worries me. There's that limited sort of understanding of the relative importance of different sources. I also frequently rant about things like switching the light off signs, because I think what that tells us is, oh, well, we're doing good things by switching our lights off. Actually, it has very little. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but in terms of relative impact, it's really not that important, particularly now with much more efficient lighting. And that's why it's important to really understand what are the big hitters. But thinking also around all of our other energy uses, internal combustion engine cars versus electric vehicles. So here we're comparing one of my colleagues' old cars with one of my colleagues' new cars, and he basically sort of did this calculation to sort of look at what was the comparative efficiency of his old internal combustion engine car versus battery electric. And you can see that sort of work through there, but really sort of highlighting one of the key benefits of electric vehicles is their energy efficiency, and they'll typically travel 3 to 4 times as far as a combustion engine on the same amount of energy. Okay. Obviously, getting that energy in different ways, but it is more efficient. Now, there's lots of interesting technologies which are being developed and new potential things which are feeding into these systems, one of which is looking actually, if we have electric vehicles, well, can they also be used as battery storage that can be used within our houses at some point? So this is something called vehicle to grid. So actually it flows the other way from the car into our houses, which I would love actually to be able to. So working at Keele, very lucky, we can charge for free, and I can go home and I can charge my house. Unfortunately, the technology is not that well developed. But actually, in the United States, this is a big thing because they have a much less stable power system, have more blackouts, and actually there's real desire for people to have this potential for vehicle to grid to allow to deal with periods of blackout. Right. Other developments. Heat pumps. So, thinking we're getting our energy service in a different way. Again, heat pumps much more efficient than traditional gas boilers. Again, an indication of electrification of a different energy service. And then energy storage. We saw the importance of that for what we're calling load shifting. So this is an example of a domestic battery. Means that we can charge it up. That overnight period where we've got much lower carbon intensity in our grid, and we can use it at periods of higher carbon intensity and potentially higher cost, because now sort of new companies like Octopus are coming up with things such as time of use tariffs to try and get people to shift their behaviour to use more energy at times of lower demand elsewhere. But storage doesn't have to be through a battery, it could also be through hot water. These can also exist as part of domestic systems. And so, the future of energy really sees us at a domestic level potentially generating our own energy, PV panels here, being able to store that energy with battery, being able to use that to produce hot water and to charge our cars. So we're starting to see this real integration of different parts of the energy system within our own domestic home scale. But this sort of idea is also very scalable. And so I couldn't not talk about some of the things that we're doing at Keele at the moment. And this is actually all of those sort of things we might have in a home, but just thinking about it at the scale of a campus, a university campus, we can imagine as actually a small town, very mixed use. We've got domestic residences, catering facilities, leisure facilities, office space, etc., etc. So at Keele, we just opened last year our low carbon energy generation park, where we have 12,500 solar panels, 2 wind turbines, 1 industrial-sized battery, which at a very minimum is producing 50% of our electricity needs as a campus. Pretty impressive in terms of amount. But what makes it really work is our Smart Energy Network demonstrator, which underpins it. And it means that it allows us to make the best use of those renewables. So it allows us, when we've got too much generation, we can put that into charging our industrial-sized battery, or we can put it into electric boilers. Because actually, we aren't allowed to export much of the energy we generate on campus into the grid. It's quite restricted. And if we hit the level of that restriction, we get our generation cut out. And that then takes about half an hour to get going again, and all of that time, when we're not able to generate, we're effectively losing money. So, in order to try to make the best use of what we're generating, we're using digital technologies to try and sort of move that energy that we're generating around. One of the things that we're looking at, we haven't quite got it working yet, is we have a lot of electric charging infrastructure for cars on campus. And we're working on a system which means that people can say what time they are going to leave and what charge they want to have in their car. And the smart digital stuff will be able to predict when the grid when the carbon intensity of the electricity is lower and charge at that time. So rather than just charging across all of the time it's plugged in, we're able to actually only charge when there's lower carbon intensity electricity. Now this is pretty amazing, and a pretty amazing sort of change in actually how our energy systems work. And it shows how the smart and the digitisation is coming into this. And we also, so we've got domestic properties as well who get requests on their smart meters to sort of turn down demand, where we've got sort of low supply or peak demand. There's also weather forecasting built in, so we know when clouds are going to cross over the solar panels, so we can start to turn down supply in some areas. So potentially turning down supply onto freezers. They'll keep their temperature for several hours. We don't need that energy to be going into them, so we can reduce that when we know we're going to get a dip in generation. One of the next stage that we're looking to develop is whether, when we've got times of excess generation, we can produce hydrogen. So we have an electrolyser on campus. It's been mothballed for about 18 months from a previous hydrogen project. And now we're looking to see whether we can sort of link our renewables, our smart energy network demonstrator, into hydrogen production. So it's genuinely green. It's a way of making use of that excess energy that we're generating on campus, particularly in summer where we generate loads and we don't have any students on campus. And then the question is, what do we do with that hydrogen? Well, Keele, we're on top of a hill, transport's a real challenge for us, and so we're looking at the potential of putting that hydrogen into cars to support sort of greener business travel. So the exciting developments continue at Keele. So just to summarise then, and this is all sort of moving to thinking about systems on a localised, place-based approach. So our energy systems are becoming more complex, more interconnected. We're seeing electrification of heat and transport rather than different energy vectors. Different geographic areas, they've got different energy infrastructure, so different area, numbers of properties on gas, different levels of grid constraints, different levels of energy demand, different infrastructure demands, different public assets, different types of housing stock, different demographics, different generation potential, different carbon sequestration potential. Different geographic areas going to differ in all of these sorts of ways. And therefore they will have different priorities and they will have different pathways. And all of this, by really a place-based approach, means that we can also join up some really diverse policy goals. So net zero, reducing inequalities, economic prosperity as well. And ultimately, it helps determine the most appropriate decarbonisation option. And I think what, for me, the really exciting thing is it allows local communities to influence the solutions and for solutions to be devised which are acceptable to local communities. But it does require us all to understand that our future energy systems, and something that I would refer to as energy transition literacy. And one of the things that we've developed as part of the Zero Carbon Rugeley project that I think Chris is going to pick up on in the next session is a training programme for community groups to help sort of people understand more about this change in our energy systems. So I'll leave it there. I did talk longer than I intended to, my apologies. And I'll leave it with my favourite quotation. Thank you very much. Questions? Unless Mark's about to kick me off.
No, if there are any questions, I won't take far bit from me to kick you off, sorry, above my pay grade.
You talked about decentralised place-based systems requiring less investment and generating more. Is there an example? Where is there somewhere in the UK that's done it, and what does it look like?
Well, so that report was based on modelling of 6 different city regions, but with quite a lot of diversity from sort of Manchester through Cambridgeshire. So it's largely modelling sort of based in terms of where those figures are coming from. There's been government investment over the past few years to get to the point where we're seeing these place-based systems. So work in Rugeley, that Chris is going to talk about, has been really doing the groundwork to work out what is the approach that would be a sort of give you a place-based solution. I don't think there's any fully integrated final systems yet. But this is such a new way of thinking. We're seeing even in policy, the language being used is changing, the understanding that actually this is an approach to take is very much sort of new thinking, and I think it's on the cusp of implementation in places. But the modelling suggests it's a good way forward.
Can I add another dimension to that? Surely, I mean, that might be a policy direction, but doesn't the fact that the national grid and the existence of private energy companies militate against that, in the same way that the petrochemical industry will suppress the development of other new sources of energy? If you've got private companies that are only incentivised, including the national grid, which, as you say, is one of the big problems, they're incentivised to centralise, surely.
Yeah, I mean, there is a centralised element of it. We're still looking at some big wind farms, which are part of that sort of centralised system. So, I think that there are big challenges in terms of switching ways of working, and certainly, there are big challenges in terms of just being able to get the number of new renewable sort of projects connected to the grid. So yeah, I think there are challenges around sort of switching some of those mindsets and where those investments sort of need to go. But I wouldn't necessarily see it as a barrier which will prevent that direction of travel.
So it's not necessarily locally owned then, decentralized. I'm slightly struggling to get my head with what it looks like. Presumably it's bigger scale than what Keele's done for Keele, but it's for a regional city. So you could have nationally owned wind farms that are local, I don't know.
Yeah, there's a number of there's different scales to the system, but allow it, so being place-based, or a place-based sort of policy approach can allow identifying what path this area should take. So if you've got an area which is not on gas, well, maybe that's a priority for electrification of heating, so do that area sort of first. You've got areas where you might be producing more energy, you know, big ground-mounted solar within an area might be right for one region. More roof-mounted solar might be right in some areas. At a smaller scale, you might be looking at reducing demand at particular times. So it's an increasingly complex system because you're seeing, you know, the bringing together of heating and transport as well. But and then that complexity is very different ultimately to a system where we've just had big energy plants and we just receive that energy.
Could I just make a comment? I was in Germany a few years ago in the Black Country looking at green energy solutions, and I was very interested in your place specific because and I thought it's something that could be potentially translated to this area, and probably easier to do in a rural area than a big, densely populated urban area. Got rural communities, Black Country obviously very mountainous and hilly, but it was very much place specific because farmers were producing green energy through methane gas on their farms. They were the perfect people to do it because they're used to dealing with electricity, having to mend, so if something was to go wrong in the middle of the night, the system was to falter. As because they're used to dealing with milking parlours and having to be their own electrician, they could solve a problem that might arise. But basically, farmers were producing place-specific, this is how I was interpreting what you were saying, perhaps on the small scale. Farmers were producing methane gas, which was being fed to all the houses in the village, including the local school, which could heat their swimming pool.
Yeah,
So I was really impressed with the way in which the community was taking control of its own energy supply. They were essentially having free energy because it was cow manure being transported to the farm, which was being very easily transformed into methane gas. That's how I was interpreting. And that's an option, it's a possibility.
And that's a really nice example of something which works in that place. And similarly, you might have other places where you have a lot of waste heat from other processes. So, you know, thank you. That's a, you know, a really nice example of how you know, it's a solution which works for a place, and different places will have different solutions.
And the point was the local community was taking control of its own energy supply.
Yeah.
And my own thoughts were they were putting a lot of trust in the farmer to supply them with that energy. And I was, you know, that question about, well, what happens if it breaks down? And they were saying, yeah, but we've got the skills, experience and tools to solve any sort of problems that might arise in the infrastructure. And the other thing was that, of course, they got the diggers to, you know, because they you know, digging ditches, etc., to lay the pipe work to supply the houses in this rather spread out community. And I was quite excited about this and thought, oh, you know, why couldn't we do something like that in this area? But obviously it needs a lot of collaboration.
Yeah, good key word.
But it also helps to have an institution with such leadership as Keele, and unfortunately we're running out of time. In fact, we're running behind time. But Zoe, first, before I thank you, you probably didn't give an advert at the start of your speech. I was called downstairs for the Climate Commission, Staffordshire Climate Commission, or did you?
No, I forgot about it.
Okay, well I will. Yeah, okay, Zoe. Well, Zoe's also chair of the new Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent Climate Commission, which, when some of us at MCA went over to Derbyshire the other week, and we actually told them about the Climate Commission, they were quite astonished in Derbyshire and said, could we have one of those? And Zoe's doing a fantastic job in getting that from governance to action, I think, and we're proud to be part of it in our small way.
And critically, it's about collaboration. You know, it's about collaborating across different sectors, which is absolutely essential in these sort of much more complex times.
Exactly, absolutely. Zoe, thank you very much. We're now going on to we'll move swiftly on to our next panel, so if I could ask my panellists to